One of the most common questions that I get asked over and over again is it okay to use canned routines, or should I use canned routines if I need to show intent or if I'm having trouble escalating, those kind of things. So what I want to talk about today is exactly what the pros and cons are of canned game versus natural game, and when I think it is appropriate to use canned game and when I think it's maybe not so appropriate or it can actually be harmful to your game. So that's what we're going to talk about. Let's crack into it. So canned game, basically, if you don't know, canned game means using lines or stories or maybe little bits that you've pre-rehearsed and you plan on saying, okay? And actually, by doing it that way, I think it's actually the wrong way to use canned game. I think the right way to use canned game is kind of to have them in the back of your head and let them come out when appropriate. But if you're ever planning to say something ahead of time or planning to use a particular line or technique, well, then you're gonna use it in like the wrong context, because everything in game is contextual, right? Every girl is different, every situation is different. So if you try and treat it like an algorithm, you try and treat it as like first A, then B, then C, then D, well, most interactions, in fact, like 99.9% of interactions don't do that. They go from A to way over here to maybe back to B, maybe they skip C and go to D, maybe they go back, and then, I mean, it's not a linear thing, okay? It's not a predictable thing. So if you're trying to turn it into that, you're gonna massively reduce your effectiveness, and you're gaming suboptimally, okay? So, but that said, canned routines can be very good in certain contexts. Context where it can be good is, say for example, you know that you need to show intent and you're having trouble with that. But you go in there and you kind of know it, but knowing you need to show intent and coming up with the line are two different things. So you can kind of separate that into two learning lessons by taking maybe a canned line for intent and just making it a point to say that line, right? So that way you learn the context, you learn the right time to use intent, but you don't have to come up with the line on the spot. And then you can focus on learning the line out of field through other training mechanisms. Or once you're comfortable doing it with a canned line, you can start improvising and using your own line. So it actually can be very useful in that context, okay? But before we get into exactly all those differences, let's get into what the pros and cons are of canned game, okay? So first, pros, and then we'll have the cons. So pros, number one, you have something to say. So you have something to say. One of the biggest fears that guys have in game is not knowing what to say. Oh, what am I gonna say to her? Or I'm gonna say the opener and then what, right? And so number one, having something to back it up is important, because one of the most important things immediately after the opener or when a conversation's not going very well, goes silent early on, is to be able to assume the burden and talk for 20 more seconds and carry the conversation to it. So having something to say can actually help you tremendously. Also psychologically, and maybe this is even more important, knowing that you have something to say can provide you the confidence to go open. I know that back in the day when we did many more like canned routine type of things, there were fewer guys that complained about approach anxiety, because they would be anxious, but you tell them just go say this exact thing. Whereas when you tell someone go over there and figure it out, that's a little bit more of a scary proposition. Now, it's actually maybe a better learning proposition or more character building proposition as well, but it is a bit scarier. So to get over that hurdle, if it helps you, A, to have something, and B, maybe more importantly, to know you have something, then that can be very, very useful, okay? Next pro of canned game, it's good. So in theory, at least from a technical standpoint, having a canned line, having a canned routine is something that's been vetted either by someone else or by you as being good game, all right? So because it's been tried and tested, there's a higher likelihood that it is good. There's also a high likelihood it follows a format that's very good and very, very useful, okay? So you're just kind of taking out some of the learning curve. However, the problem with it's good is that good is relative to context. What's good in the first 2 minutes might be very bad half an hour in, right? And so it's good as a relative thing, but it could be, it's inherently, it is a good game technique for some circumstance, but that doesn't necessarily mean you're gonna use it in that circumstance or gain the full benefit from it. But yeah, it is inherently, potentially something good, okay? Here's another big one. Teaches structure. Okay, it teaches you structure. And what do I mean by that? A lot of guys, when they're talking to a girl, when they're gaming, they don't know what to do next. Like, okay, well, I got to this point, but oh, then what, right? Whereas if you have sat down and said, I'm going to do this, then this, then this, then this, then this. Now, the interaction might not follow that structure very often. It might go all kinds of different ways, but at least you have a map. It's like if you were, lost in the woods and you'd at least look at a map of the area, you might find a few familiar landmarks and not get quite as lost. Okay, so the map is never going to be followed exactly, but having that map in your head is helpful. And the thing about canned game is at least there was a structure. So you would see fewer of the half-hour conversation to nowhere back in the day when we had a much more canned approach to game. On the other hand, you would see a lot more of guys being awkward and socially robotic and really creeping girls out. So there are pros and cons, but at the very least, it did teach structure, all right? So those, I would say, are the major pros of canned game. You have something to say, it's technically good, and it gives you a roadmap, it gives you sort of a game plan and a structure. And those are very, very powerful things. Oh, here's another one actually I'll add to it. It's kind of with the it's good thing. I kind of mentioned it, but you believe in it. Okay, so this is a student of mine once coined the term agentic state on boot camp. And basically what this meant was because I had told him to do something, he had a lot of confidence in it because he'd seen me get success and then I was telling it to him. So it kind of turned off his disbelief and just went and did it, right? So because it came from an authority, because it came from a noted success, he believed in it. And what made it work, hopefully it was a good technique because I was teaching it, so it probably was. But also because he believed in it, he did it with conviction. He did it more the right way than if he'd done it, they'd come up with himself and he was unsure of himself. Okay, so actually that belief is very, very valuable as well. So I'd say those are a lot of the positives with canned game. Now let's talk about what some of the negatives are with canned game. Okay, first negative with canned game is what I call the crowbar. And what I mean is trying to wedge something or jam something in where it doesn't belong. Okay, so a lot of guys, they learn canned game and they like to go A, B, C, D, do it exactly this way and like force the girl through this one particular interaction pattern, right? A terrible example of this is a lot of guys, there's a moving game called the spin handshake where you take the girl's hand, you like spin her around like a dance move. A lot of guys, they sort of develop this like canned routine stack where that's a move for them. That's something they do early on. And then if they take the girl's hand and try and spin her and she doesn't spin, they're like, no, spin, spin. They try and like physically force her around and make her spin because they're looking at it as this very linear process where like I have to do this, then this, then this, then this, and this. And if any step is violated, they don't know where they are, right? So they're trying to crowbar something in because they're too rigid, all right? So you could say a crowbar, you could say like / rigid. Game should never be rigid because like I said, most interactions are not going to go according to plan. They're going to go in a very different way and you need to be able to adapt to what you're doing, adapt to that in order to get a proper result. So that's very, very, very critical, okay? So first, crowbar and rigid. Second is blind. And what I mean by that is it's being applied blindly, it's being applied without a lot of insight. So say that in one of my videos, you see me say a particular line to a girl and it goes really well. You're like, oh shit, Todd used that line, it's really good. Well, what you don't know is you may not know the history I have with that girl. You may not know that I already know her blueprint is kind of feisty and she will accept that line really well. Or you may not know that she already views me as having massive value. So what I really need to do is get her to open up and develop a lot of comfort. So if you don't know that context and you use it in the wrong context, what is a good line has suddenly become a bad line because you're using it blindly, okay? So the problem with canned lines sometimes is if you're just using it and you don't understand it, if you're doing it as an executable rather than as a blanket understanding, you're gonna have a lot of those problems, okay? Next is robotic. Robotic meaning you're delivering the line, but you aren't delivering the line. It's coming out of your mouth, it's being said, but your eyes are incongruent or your voice is incongruent, your body language is incongruent, and it doesn't make sense. Good example of this would be like, say you use the opener, hey, I thought you were cute and I wanted to meet you, my name is, and introduce yourself, right? Now, if you say that and you look her in the eye and she really can tell that there's some intent there and you mean it, that can be a pretty decent opener. But if you're like staring off into space like, hey, I saw you, you looked cute and I thought I'd meet you, that's completely incongruent. That's completely robotic and there's nothing going on there, right? Or if you deliver a push-pull line with no emphasis, you're like, yeah, there's part of me that thinks you're a good girl and part of me that thinks you're a bad girl. Like it's not gonna work, right? So it can be very robotic because when you're not in the moment that created those lines, it's very easy to slip into just sort of going through the motions, right? And now I gave you extreme examples, but to a greater or lesser degree, Tons and tons of guys do this. Final thing that is very, very bad that happens with inner game, and this is actually huge long term. With canned routines is the inner game. So I misspoke. But the canned routines mess up your inner game, and here's why. It's attribution. So attribution, if you don't know, it means basically what you give credit to for an event. So attribution, if you go in and you say whatever comes to your mind and you get a good result, you're going to attribute that good result to you, to your personality, to your fundamental essence and nature. If you go in and use a line or a routine and get a result, you're going to probably attribute that success to the line or routine being good. Okay, and so that's good in a way because you're learning what good lines and routines are, but it's bad on a deep level because you start to get this mentality. You're starting to train your brain to think that you need the lines, you need the routines, or you're not enough without them, right? I can remember I've been on, back in the day when I was doing routine-based game, there were times I'd be on a date with a girl and I'd like run out of routines and I'd like run to the I'd like excuse myself, go to the bathroom, and I had a notebook where I had like my routines list and I'd have to like go like review my routines and find like, you know, what one haven't I used and then come back. And you know, you could kind of stumble and bumble through doing that, but what are you doing to your psychology when you're like, fuck, I can't even have a conversation with a girl without a routine, right? It fundamentally is bad in your game, and it fundamentally is reducing your entitlement. And so routines to a great extent sort of fake being an alpha guy, but in a certain sense, if you fake it and good feedback, you can grow into it. But in another sense, in a very real sense, if you attribute your results to the routines, you keep yourself from ever becoming that person. You become a button pusher or a routine junkie, that sort of thing. And actually, that's a final one I'll add is this, which is button pushing. And the idea with button pushing comes from this. Because they are good, because routines are technically good in a way, what happens is a lot of times they get a very predictable and positive looking or positive seeming result. And so what happens is you can kind of get addicted to, I say this thing and I get this positive result, and I say this other thing, I get this positive result. And you develop this entire interaction where essentially you're just like poking, like trying to push a button and get a reaction. And in a way, it feels like you're dictating and dominating things, but in another way, you're extremely reactive to her, because you're making the whole interaction about her reactions, all right? A great metaphor someone gave me once upon a time, he said, how do you train a bad comedian? And he said, well, what you do is you put him on stage with nothing but confusion. And what'll happen is he'll go and he won't know what to say, so he'll do the first like dumb thing that comes to his mind, and the audience may laugh out of sympathy, or they may laugh out of the awkwardness of the situation. And so then his brain is training him that awkwardness is comedy or is humor. And so then he'll try the next little awkward thing. And eventually, if he goes down that route, he's only going to ever develop a routine of really cheap, dumb jokes. He'll have no personality, no cohesion. He can never become a truly great comic that way. He can become a guy that gets a couple of cheap laughs until the audience realizes what he's doing. And they're just like, oh, it's old, okay? If you become the button pusher, if you become the guy that just learns how to get the cheap reaction or the cheap laugh, yes, you'll get those, but you're fundamentally hurting your ability to develop a richness and depth to your game where you're going to be able to really be influential and develop a deep connection with a girl and really kind of a deep emotional connection with yourself as a man in game. So you want to be very careful about that. Okay, so that said, those are the pros and cons. When do I personally use canned routines in game, and in what way do I use canned routines in game? And there are a few examples of where I do, and I'll show you what they are. Okay, so in game, there are what I call waypoints. Now, a waypoint is anything that predictably kind of has to happen in game, right? Every set is different. Every interaction is different. Every girl is different, but certain things are going to happen. For example, in a successful cold approach, at some point, you need to have a shift between where she's just like tolerating you and listening to where she actually participates in the conversation. That's a waypoint. We call that the hook point. Right? That's like, people call it the social hook point even, right? So that's a waypoint. That has to happen in just about every successful interaction. Another waypoint is establishing some sort of physicality. That's something that's gonna have to happen in order to lead to sex, right? So even though the interactions themselves can go like, a billion different directions, there are certain predictable waypoints. And so what I will use routines for personally is I don't like to use them as defaults, because again, I like to believe that I'm enough. And also because what I've noticed is once you have an underlying structure, the things you come up with in the moment are more appropriate to that moment. Again, you're not trying to crowbar them in. We talked about that a second ago. You're not trying to crowbar it. It's happening naturally. That's better. However, if whatever you're doing naturally isn't getting a result or you're stuck at a particular waypoint, in that context, having something canned that you know is a predictable way to get through that waypoint can be a good sort of crutch to lean on to get through it. Now, if you're doing it in every single set, I would recommend learning fundamentally the ideas behind the waypoint so it doesn't happen. But if every once in a while you get a girl that just you're having trouble with a particular thing, there's nothing really wrong with using a routine and getting through it. All right, so key waypoints I would say off the top of my head would be opening. I don't mind using a canned opener. I'll talk about that in a second. I actually prefer not to, but I don't hate it. Hooking, the point of where she's qualifying. How about maybe the point of physicality? The last little segment of like a pull, like the venue change maybe. There are a couple little routine type things you could do for a venue change. Those types of things. So those are examples. That's clearly not an extensive or conclusive or comprehensive list, but those are examples of the type of things I'm talking about as waypoints. When you're getting to like one of those things and you're like, it's just not happening, I'm trying things, it's not happening, that might be a decent place to use a canned routine, okay? Next thing with canned routines that I want to mention is the type of canned routines and lines you want to use. There's basically two types. I would say type 1 is learned, meaning they come from an external source. Learn from an external. For example, if you see something that I did in a video, that's learned from an external source. You saw me do it and you're trying to adopt it into your game, right? Or if you read something on a forum or in an article about game, you're like, oh, that sounds like a good line. That's a learned routine that you're then applying. It came from outside of your game and outside of your creation, and you're trying to, I don't want to say crowbar because we were saying it's a bad thing, but typically this is a bad thing in a similar way. It's going to be harder to implement into your game than if it was coming more naturally. And that's the second type, which is what I call organic. Organic routines are, say for example, you're talking with a girl, it's going really well, you're kind of at your best, and you come up with a great story. And then you realize it worked really well. And then maybe you make a note of that and you say, that's a good story, maybe I'll tell that some other time. But then you don't go into the next interaction and say, oh, I'm gonna use this story in exactly this context. You say to yourself, oh, here's a fun story, it's kind of in the back of my head and I'm just gonna go out and have fun. And then at the right time, your brain may bring that story back up. So you're making a note of the good lines that you've heard and said, the good stories that you've come up with, things like that, and the things that you really relate and resonate with, maybe opinions that you really love expressing, those kind of things. You make a note of it, but you're not overtly trying to get into conversation. It just will come up more often because it's in the back of your head. And the great thing about this is when you say these things, it's gonna come out natural, right? So you're gonna use something that's canned, ideally again, for one of these waypoints, but it's gonna come out natural and it's gonna be congruent with you. That's very important, congruent with you. What's good game for me, because I have a particular personality, not all of it will work for you. And that's the same with anyone you learn from. A lot of it will, because it's coming from a fundamentally good place, right? The understanding is there. But certain things, my personality is different than yours. And certain things that you do successfully, I might have trouble replicating for the same reason because we have different personalities. And that's why anything that's canned organic is going to be easier to implement and generally better than anything that is learned and external, okay? So those are the ways and reasons that I will use canned game. Now, just to make this really concrete, I'm going to give you a specific example of opening, okay? People ask, should I use a canned opener, that sort of thing. Well, I don't believe in using a canned opener, but I do believe in having a canned opener. And here's why. Typically, if I walk over and talk to a girl and I say whatever's on my mind and I'm present in the moment, really interacting with the girl, that's going to come off really well because probably 90% of the communication doesn't even have to do with the words. It has to do with my body language, my eye contact, how I'm conveying myself, what my frame is, and like, how intentful I'm feeling and being. Right? So if I focus too much on the words and that gets in the way of expressing my natural nature of that moment, then that's going to kind of hold me back. So going with the canned routine isn't optimal. It absolutely isn't optimal. However, the problem with having nothing in your head, not having anything in the can, is say you see a really hot girl and you kind of want to give yourself an excuse. you're kind of like, oh, fuck, well, but I don't know what to say, or but this is tough, or whatever. The good thing about having the canned routine is in that context, you can just say, I'm going to walk over and figure it out. And if something comes to me, I'll say it and I'll do it. If something doesn't come to me, I'll fall back on this canned thing. So it gives you the safety blanket of knowing that you always have something. And that's very powerful because it means that psychologically and in terms of action, there are no excuses. So it'll actually get you to do a lot more of the right things when you feel that you have that behind you. So I actually do believe in like having canned routines, but I believe in using them as little as possible. And what I've noticed from my own game and from when I teach students is that when I'm using a lot of canned routines, I kind of like fumble and bumble through it because I know a lot about game and I still get decent results. But the nights when I do the absolute best are the nights when I'm truly being myself and just letting myself go liberally and naturally. And I'm not trying to say anything canned. And some things do come out that I've said before, but those are the things that are right in the moment and the things I'm actually enjoying saying as opposed to the things I'm saying to get a reaction, okay? So that's the other key thing, is it needs to be coming from that place of enjoyment and the right conveyance of your personality, not about button pushing. Because anything that comes off as button pushing comes off as manipulative, reactive, and that is inherently lower value, okay? So upshot of all this, there are right times and wrong times to use routines, in my opinion. I think that they should never be your primary go-to. Oh, I will say one other thing. One other reason that it could be very good to use a routine, which actually isn't good game, but it's good learning, is if you are having an issue with a particular type of game, right? Say, for example, you're having trouble getting physical. I do endorse using some sort of physical routine stack for that, just so that you don't have to, you can simplify your learning process. And you can learn it in stages and steps instead of having to tackle it as one big sort of like, nebulous thing, okay? So for learning, it may not even be the best game, but it can be good for learning, okay? But in general, look, it's good to have canned routines. It's actually good to understand where they come from because it gives you that structure. However, on a practical level, anytime that you can be in the moment and conveying your personality truly, you're almost always going to do better with that than you will with the canned routines. So use them as a backup, a safety blanket, something to have, a little crowbar for certain little waypoints, but don't use them as your overall strategy because you'll be robotic, you'll be manipulative, and you won't grow as much psychologically in game and as a human being. Okay, so that's my take on canned versus uncanned. So upshot, have the canned routines, but try very much not to use them.